Well, hello, welcome again. It's Andrew, and this is episode 35. And today we're continuing in our series in the Gospel of Matthew as we explore Jesus' vision of the kingdom of heaven. And today we picked it up at Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through to 8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." This passage opens the issue that the Pharisees most struggled with in Jesus: differing perspectives on the Sabbath. For the Pharisees, the matter is simple. The law is the law, and if it is broken, God is displeased. And if God is displeased, we ultimately all suffer. In the end, this, and what follows, comes down to profoundly different understandings of the nature of God. For the religious, God was holy, and God's holiness required the strict obedience of rules. If the rules were broken, this was a deep offence against the character of God, and at some deep level a violation of the very order of the universe itself. Consequently, everything could unravel. Israel had experiences of things unraveling because, in their minds, the law was broken, particularly the Sabbath law. For the religious, it was a straightforward cause and effect. Break the law, God is angry, punishment follows. To avoid punishment, we need to keep the law. Simple. So we need to make sure that the law is not broken. Lynn and I and our youngest experienced the extent they were willing to go to in 1998 when we visited the Holy Land. We went to Israel. We actually arrived, we didn't realize it because we hadn't planned it, but we arrived on the exact day of the 50th celebrations of Israel's statehood. It was chaotic, but it was an interesting experience. We were staying in the Holiday Inn in the centre of Jerusalem. And on the Sabbath, as we rode the elevators in this very tall building, they stopped on every floor. This was because it had a Sabbath setting on it in its automated control system. And what the Sabbath setting did, it was make sure that it stopped at every floor so that no one was required to do the work of pushing a button to select the floor they wanted to get off at. Sabbath observance was, and apparently still is, taken very seriously. I don't imagine it's changed too much in the intervening 22 years. For the Pharisees in particular, the issue of Sabbath is central. The Pharisees arose out of the Babylonian captivity. In the words of Boney M. and also of Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yeah, we wept when we remembered Zion. And how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" They were hundreds of kilometers away from home. The temple was gone. The sacrificial system was gone. All of it left behind. How now did they become obedient followers of Yahweh. What did this look like? And what emerged was the synagogue and its keepers, the Pharisees. And they were keen. They were the people of the book. These were the evangelicals of their day. And they saw with absolute clarity that it was the trashing of the Sabbath that had resulted in this terrible judgment, this terrible captivity and the desolations against Israel. And there's truth to this. But what they failed to recognize was that the Sabbath observance was simply the canary in the mine. It was pointing to something much deeper. Its falling away was pointed to other deeper issues that had gone seriously wrong. Jesus hints at this in verse 7, where he supports his disciples' supposed violation of the Sabbath, picking heads of corn in the fields on the Sabbath, which is kind of akin to pushing elevator buttons in hotels. And he puts it like this, in verse 7, we read it, "If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless." Now this references back to Hosea 6:6. "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, an acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings." And we get a fuller exposition of it really in Micah chapter 6 verses 6 to 8. Micah says this, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And there's the line. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Jesus challenges the proposition that it's just about Sabbath observance. He points to the apparent contradictions in the law. He basically asks in verse 5, if the Sabbath law is so ironclad, how come priests who serve in the temple on the Sabbath performing duties, actually working hard, are not condemned and punished? After all, they're technically breaking the law. And it's much more serious than pushing elevator buttons. And while it's true that there are passages that attribute the captivity and desolations to violations of the Sabbath, the truth is that this was simply the end result of so many other things that had gone wrong. A people who no longer, if they ever did, obey the law of Jubilee, where property was to be returned to their original families and slaves set free. A people who did not allow the land its Sabbath rest, allowing it to lie fallow, and in order to do that needed to trust God for abundance in the preceding year. A people who consistently, it seems, ripped off their neighbours. A people who continued to worship the gods of Canaan. And it's quite shocking, but if you actually go through, you'll discover this to be the case. The Baals and the starry host of heaven, and of particular offence to God was the worship of Moloch, where the firstborn was sacrificed in the fire. And finally, there was Sabbath observance. I suspect that this was simply an inconvenient interruption of the efficient continuation of commerce. Why would we stop when there is so much to be done? So much money, more money, still to be made. The Sabbath had now simply become an inconvenience, an interruption on the wonderful, rich, ka-ching flow of everyday life. Not too dissimilar to our day, eh? Sabbath is important. I want you to hear me on this. Sabbath is important. Not because God needs to rest, but because God knows we need to. Sabbath is God's gift to us, a grace from God who has hardwired into us a 7-day rhythm where rest is required. It's out of God's love and generosity that Sabbath was given. Out of a deep concern from God that we live full and rich lives. And in that we are best served when we draw aside, put our tools down, suspend our business, breathe, and allow ourselves to slow down and just be. To experience the quietness and to see and appreciate what is around us, and to turn our hearts in gratitude toward the one who created and sustains all of this. Sabbath was a gift to us, not just another rule that needed to be slavishly obeyed in order to keep a rigid and unbending God happy. Jesus challenges the understanding of Sabbath and of the law itself. He ultimately challenges their view of God. I suspect it's their view of God that he finds the most offensive. It's their view of God that informs their understanding of the nature of reality, of how things really are. They do not see God the way that he experiences God, as Father, as Abba, as Papa. For them, God is a predictable, implacable and exacting tyrant who is constantly watching them to make sure they don't step out of line. Many of us today, even those who claim the name of Christ, effectively live under this worldview. I did. God is waiting for us to break the law, ready to zap us in this way of thinking. Although we might loudly trumpet that God is love, underneath it all, we're by no means sure. And we live in fear. Although we claim that there is no condemnation to those in Christ Jesus, living under condemnation is part of the everyday experience of so many of us. It is not the way of Jesus. Now we'll pick up this theme again tomorrow in our Sunday service as we move to the next part of the story with the Sabbath healing of the man with the withered hand. It's as we continue to engage with Jesus' vision of the kingdom of heaven that our own understanding of the personhood, the nature and the character of God changes in positive and life-giving ways. And we see that Jesus accurately represents to us who God is, what God is like, and that the heart of God is love, rich, full and generous. God bless you all. Amen.